Life stories are filled with twists and turns. And today's tale is one of growth, self-discovery, and the courage to break free from toxic expectations. In this story, a young woman rises to success, only to face the harsh reality that her family views her as a source of financial support rather than as a person. With each sacrifice and every boundary crossed, she learns that true freedom comes from standing up for herself, even if it means walking away from everything she's ever known. Let's dive into this powerful journey of empowerment and resilience. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to begin today's story. I grew up in a quiet suburban town, a place where the rhythm of life moved at a steady pace, where neighbors greeted one another with the familiarity of routine, and where the air was often filled with the distant hum of everyday life. Our home was modest, yet it held an unspoken promise of stability. My parents, both hardworking and ever focused on the future, had set clear expectations for me from an early age. My mother worked as an accountant at a local firm, and my father was a project manager for a construction company. Both were driven, dedicated, and, above all, deeply committed to their work. They provided well for our family. But their vision for my life was something more, a vision they had for both me and my younger sister. Olivia, 3 years younger than me, was always the more carefree one. She had the ease of someone who wasn't constantly under the microscope, the freedom to explore life without the weight of responsibility pressing on her shoulders. Growing up, it often felt as though Olivia could do no wrong. She was the child who was allowed to make mistakes and learn from them in a way that was never afforded to me. I was the eldest, and with that position came a sense of duty to set an example. To be the one who always did the right thing, who excelled in everything. I remember my mother's voice, clear and often stern, reminding me daily, "Sarah, you need to set a better example for Olivia. You're the oldest, you should know better." Those words became a mantra in my head, repeating constantly, like the spinning of a broken record. Every day, I would hear that refrain as I worked through my schoolwork. As I struggled with the complexity of life, the expectations were always higher for me. If I forgot to clean my room or failed to get an A on a test, the consequences felt more profound than if Olivia made the same mistake. It wasn't that I wasn't loved, it was just that the love came with a sense of obligation. I was expected to achieve, to be the best, and to lead by example. One evening, when I was 16 and Olivia was 13, I remember sitting at the dining room table with my textbooks spread out before me. I was knee-deep in a calculus assignment, struggling to solve complex equations, while Olivia sat beside me, doodling absent-mindedly in her notebook. She was supposed to be working on her English essay, but the words didn't seem to come to her as easily as they did for me. I watched her, frustrated and envious of the ease with which she could be carefree. And soon enough, I heard her voice, filled with annoyance. "I don't feel like doing this essay." She sighed. "It's too hard." I glanced at my mother, who was in the kitchen preparing dinner, wiping her hands on her apron. Without hesitation, she walked over to Olivia and smiled gently. "Sweetie, it's okay. You're trying your best. Maybe you can work on it tomorrow when you're feeling more inspired." I couldn't help but scoff at the difference in response. I had struggled with my own assignment the week before, and the response had been far different. My mother's tone shifted, sharp and pointed as she turned to me. "Is something funny, Sarah?" she asked. I kept my voice steady. "No, Mom, I just solved a problem," I said, trying to keep my frustration in check. But inside, I was boiling. It wasn't fair. I had worked so hard for everything, while Olivia seemed to get off easy. "Focus on your own work," I added, my words laced with bitterness. "You know you need to maintain those grades if you want to get into a good college." In that moment, it became clear to me that no matter what I did, it would never be enough. My dreams were always secondary to the needs of my family, always overshadowed by the burden of responsibility. I had dreams of my own, dreams of going to Harvard, of studying computer science in one of the most prestigious programs in the country. But when I brought it up during my junior year, the reaction was immediate and dismissive. "Sarah, be realistic," my father said one evening during dinner, as if the very idea of attending such an expensive school was laughable. "Private colleges are expensive, And we need to save money for Olivia's education. She might need extra support. That stung. I had worked hard to keep up my grades and take on leadership roles in extracurricular activities. But it didn't matter. My dreams were being sidelined for Olivia's future. Your grades are good enough to get into any state school with a scholarship. My father continued, as if it were that simple. That's what we can afford. I sat there, staring at the Princeton brochure in my lap. My heart sinking. How could they not see how much this meant to me? Later that evening, my best friend Rachel came over to visit. She found me sitting cross-legged on my bed, surrounded by college materials, feeling the weight of my family's expectations pressing down on me. She didn't have to say anything, the look on her face said it all. They shot it down, didn't they? She asked gently, sitting beside me. Yeah, I sighed, staring at the brochure in my hands. Apparently, I need to be realistic and save the college fund for Olivia. Rachel was quiet for a moment before responding. But you don't have to live their dream. Sarah, you can still make yours happen. Even if you're not going to Princeton. That doesn't mean you can't make a name for yourself. Her words, though comforting, didn't erase the hurt I felt. But in that moment, something inside me shifted. I made a vow to myself. I would succeed, not despite their limitations, but because of them. They had taught me one valuable lesson. If I wanted something, I would have to fight for it on my own terms. And that was exactly what I did. After I graduated from State University, my life began to take shape in ways I hadn't imagined. I had done it, made it on my own terms. Despite my family's limitations, I wasn't headed to Princeton. But I had earned my degree, built my own path, and created something I was truly proud of, Taskmaster. The app I had developed to help people manage their tasks and routines more effectively. It started as an idea scribbled in my notebook during late-night study sessions. But with a lot of hard work, passion, and sleepless nights, it had become something much bigger. I remember sitting in that boardroom, the air thick with anticipation, as executives from a major tech company tested my app. Their faces were unreadable, and for a moment, I questioned whether all my effort had been worth it. But then the CEO leaned forward, a smile breaking across his face as he inspected the design. The functionality. This is impressive work, he said. Very impressive. I still couldn't quite believe it when the deal was struck. $5 million. A check for $5 million landed in my bank account. And for a moment, everything felt surreal. My hands shook as I looked at the number on the screen. A mix of disbelief and excitement flooding through me. I hadn't done this for the money. But it felt like the universe had finally acknowledged all the effort I had poured into my work. The first thing I did was buy a modest but nice apartment in a good neighborhood. Something practical. Something I had earned. The second thing I did was start my own mobile app development company. Determined to invest in the future of the business I had created. The rest of the money went into savings and investments. I wasn't going to let this opportunity slip away. But when I told my family, their reactions were interesting, to say the least. My mother had to sit down when I told her, her face pale with shock. My father, ever the skeptic, just kept shaking his head. Olivia, well, Olivia simply stared at me, her expression unreadable. I had worked so hard to get here. But in the blink of an eye, it felt like everything had shifted. I wasn't just Sarah, the responsible older sister anymore. Suddenly, I was Sarah, the millionaire, and that change didn't feel quite as wonderful as I had imagined it would. Within weeks, the requests began. At first, it was subtle, small comments about how my success should benefit the family. But it didn't take long for things to escalate. When Olivia got engaged, I offered to give her a generous $20 for her wedding, thinking it would be a nice gesture. After all, this was her big day, and I could afford it. But then, things took a turn. Olivia, with her perfect timing and subtle manipulation, started to plant seeds. You know, Sarah, weddings these days are so expensive. I've been dreaming about this amazing honeymoon in the Maldives. Don't you want me to have the perfect wedding? She said, her voice taking on that familiar, whiny tone. My mother chimed in, too, adding her own pressure. $20 is a lot for a wedding gift. But it's nothing to you now, right? I couldn't help but feel the sting of those words. The subtle guilt-tripping was so familiar. It almost felt like it had been written into the script of our family life. But I didn't want to disappoint Olivia. After all, it was her wedding. So, after some coaxing and guilt-laden conversations, I agreed, not just to the $20 gift, but to cover the cost of their honeymoon in the Maldives as well. It wasn't the money that bothered me, but the way it felt like my family was starting to view me as their personal bank account. It was a pattern that started to emerge, slowly at first, then more obviously with each passing week. The more I gave, the more they expected. I bought my mother a designer handbag for her birthday, something I thought she would love. But when she saw it, she smiled, nodded, but said, "This is lovely, sweetie," though I saw a much prettier one at that boutique downtown. My father wasn't much better. I helped him with a car repair, covering the cost of a new transmission. "You know," he said, laughing, "for someone who makes millions, you're pretty tight with your wallet. Could have thrown in an extra $1,000 for new tires." Each time I gave, it felt as though I was being measured by my bank account rather than my intentions. Their comments stung, and yet, I tried to push them down, telling myself that they were just jokes. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized they weren't jokes at all. They were expectations wrapped in humor. One afternoon, as I was having coffee with my mother, she casually mentioned that Olivia had loved the coffee maker I gave her as a housewarming gift. But then she added, "I saw this fully automatic espresso machine at that boutique downtown. It would have been perfect for Olivia's morning routine." I set my cup down, a bit too forcefully. "Mom, that coffee maker cost $500. She waved her hand dismissively, as though it didn't matter. "When you have as much as you do, what's a few hundred more between sisters?" The weight of her words settled heavily in my chest. This wasn't about gifts anymore. It was about something deeper, a realization that my family wasn't seeing me as their daughter anymore, but as a source of financial support. And I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep playing along. It took me a while to fully comprehend what was happening, what my family was becoming. It was subtle at first, this shift in their expectations of me. But after a while, it became clear that the more I achieved, the more they felt entitled to my success. It was a toxic dynamic, one that I hadn't recognized immediately. And by the time I did, I was already deep into it. The tipping point came when Olivia and Tom came back from their honeymoon. I had expected some peace after their wedding, time to relax and reflect on everything I had accomplished, but instead, a new demand loomed over me. It was at a family dinner, just a few weeks after their return, when the bombshell dropped. Olivia, sitting at the dinner table with a smug grin on her face, casually announced, "We've decided it's time for us to have our own home." That's great, I thought. Finally, they were going to move out. After all, they were both working, Olivia as a marketing coordinator and Tom in finance. I had assumed they'd been saving for their own place, like any responsible adults would. But then, the tone shifted. "Well," Olivia continued, "since you're so successful now and have more money than you know what to do with, we've decided that you should buy us a house." I froze, unable to process what I had just heard. I glanced around the table at my parents. They didn't say anything, but I could feel their eyes on me, waiting for a response. It felt like a betrayal, a sharp sting in my chest. "Excuse me?" I finally managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. Olivia, as if rehearsed, began to elaborate. "Well, you live in your beautiful apartment, bought outright. Meanwhile, I'm still living with Mom and Dad. It's not fair. You have millions in the bank, and I need my own place. I'm not going to waste money on rent. You have the means to help me, so you should." The words hung in the air like a challenge, an accusation. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I had worked for every penny I had, struggled, sacrificed, and built something from nothing, and now my own sister was demanding I hand over a fortune for her new home. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure. "I don't understand. Why would I buy you a house?" "Because you can," she replied, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. The room went quiet, but the tension was unbearable. My parents, who had always instilled in me the value of hard work, were suddenly silent, their faces passive. I wanted to shout, to call out the injustice of it all. How could they expect me to do something like this? It wasn't just about money, it was about respect. About boundaries, and they had crossed it. I had to act, to put an end to this before it spiraled further. I can help, I said, my voice steady now, though anger simmered beneath the surface. If you need money for a down payment, I can provide an interest-free loan. But it will be done properly, through my lawyer. We'll do it by the book. That should have been the end of it. But Olivia's response was swift. And it hit me like a slap. Are you kidding me? She cried. Her voice laced with venom. You're just jealous because I'm happily married. And you're alone with your precious money. The words stung. I felt my heart race. My blood boiling. Jealous? I repeated, incredulous. I gave you $20 for your wedding and paid for your honeymoon. That money could have covered my living expenses for an entire year. What more do you want from me? Olivia wasn't done. Poor Sarah, always counting pennies despite her millions. You're pathetic. I stood up, feeling the weight of my fury rising. I earned every cent I have. I said, my voice cold. I built my company from the ground up. I live within my means and invest in my business. I have employees who depend on me. I don't have time for this entitlement. But my words fell on deaf ears. My mother, sitting in silence up until now, finally spoke, her voice laced with disappointment. I'm ashamed of you, Sarah. How can you be so stingy? I laughed, though it was bitter and hollow. Stingy? I've given Olivia more money in the past few months than most people make in a year. And this is how you repay me? My father's voice joined in. What kind of sister are you? The words struck deep, but I held my ground. This wasn't about money anymore, it was about my dignity. The realization hit me hard. No matter what I gave, it would never be enough. I would always be seen as a source to extract from, not as a person. This was the final straw. Without another word, I picked up my purse, my heart pounding in my chest. And I walked out the door. I could hear my mother's voice calling after me. But I didn't turn back. I couldn't. I knew that if I stayed, I would lose something far more important than my family's approval. I would lose my self-respect. As I walked out of that house, the weight of the world seemed to lift off my shoulders. My heart was heavy, but for the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of freedom. I had spent so much of my life trying to please my family, to gain their approval, but in the end, all they wanted was to take from me. I realized that their love came with strings attached. And I had been too blind to see it until now. The months that followed were quiet. I threw myself into my work, focusing on my company and my own growth. I started therapy, something I had put off for years, and began the long process of healing. The space I created for myself allowed me to rediscover my own worth, independent of the expectations and demands of my family. Slowly, I started to build a new life, one that didn't revolve around guilt or manipulation. I made new friends who saw me for who I truly was, not for what I could give them. And then came the call from Aunt Linda, a voice of reason and comfort in the chaos of my family. Your mother's been trying to reach you, she said, her tone filled with concern. She says it's urgent. But I had made my decision. I no longer needed their approval. And I wasn't going to let them pull me back into their web of guilt and shame. I had learned the hard way that sometimes walking away isn't an ending, it's a beginning. The family I was born into wasn't the family I was meant to keep. And sometimes, the greatest act of self-love is simply saying no to those who treat your boundaries like suggestions. To follow more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for new life stories.